Readability Formulas in the Wild, and authors are Scott Crossley, Stephen Skalichkin, Cynthia Berger, and Ali Haidari. And Scott will be presenting the paper. Please.
Yeah, hi everybody. So I'm very much interested in text readability and how this relates to engineering opportunities for students to read appropriate texts more often, and as such, learning to read to a greater degree. So text readability very much focuses on processing, which is how fast you read, and comprehension, which is how well you understand something. The purpose is to understand the reading process and hopefully to develop models of reading comprehension. But most importantly, from an educational standpoint, we want to better match text to readers' proficiency so that readers have text that they can notice language, comprehend the language, and intake that language. I'm going to give you a really quick overview of readability processing model from a linguistics perspective. The first is this idea of decoding, that's recognizing words and assessing the semanticity or the meaning of those words. Then you take those words, you place them together, and you start to develop syntactic parses for them. So is this a noun phrase? Is this a verb phrase? Is this a sentence? Are these two dependent clauses? From there, you can begin to develop some type of meaning. And hopefully in the end, you have a coherent representation of that text that will lead to some type of comprehension. I'm a linguist, and from a linguistics perspective, we can look at and measure these various processes. So decoding, we can look at lexical sophistication, potentially like the frequency of words. From syntactic parsing, we can look at the complexity of the syntactic parse. Does it have a lot of dependent clauses, or is it just one single independent clause? With meaning construction, we can look at things like local and global cohesion or the use of connectives. And for coherence, we can look at situational model features. So maybe the causal cohesion of a text, or the spatial or temporal cohesion. Now, this has been done traditionally using readability formulas. And hopefully you're familiar with some of these, but they're basically just mathematical algorithms that predict how difficult a text is. The three probably most commonly seen formulas are Fleisch-Kincaid, and this is all in English, by the way, Fleisch-Kincaid reading ease, Fleisch-Kincaid grade level, and the new Dahl-Chall readability formula. One problem with these is that they're very much focused on very simplified text features. So Fleisch-Kincaid and Fleisch-Kincaid grade level basically say, hey, if words are shorter on average in the text is easier to read. And the other thing they say is that if a sentence is longer on average, the text is harder to read. So they're trying to get at word decoding, and they're trying to get at syntactic complexity. Now, lots of problems with these. Number one is they act only as proxies for text importance. They focus on these really surface level linguistic features that aren't very sophisticated. They are frequently misapplied. So the Fleisch-Kincaid grade level was developed with adult readers, but it's scaled from grade 1 to 12, which is a bit of a dissimilarity. They were generally developed using very small data sets from which they were known. So Fleisch-Kincaid grade level was developed with 18 texts. That's right, 1-8, only 18 texts. They don't include discourse features related to meaning construction or coherence. And all traditional readability formulas and newer readability formulas ignore things like background knowledge and reading proficiency. So all of us could read a text, but we might come away with a different comprehension of that text based on our expectations and our background knowledge. All right, so what have we been doing? My team, including Mihai and the audience, we've been developing a number of new readability formulas. And the two that we're going to talk about today are the crowdsourced algorithm for reading comprehension and the crowdsourced algorithm for reading speed. These use more advanced natural language processing features to predict readability. And they also use much larger corpora or text samples to predict readability. And they have been shown generally to outperform traditional readability formulas, hopefully because they're more intelligent and they're more purpose-oriented. And if they outperform traditional readability formulas, then we know, hey, these might be better algorithms from which to provide feedback to select text for readers. All right, so The goals of this study is to compare these newly developed and more intelligent readability formulas, traditional readability formulas, using behavioral data. In this case, we're talking about text processing data, how long it takes somebody to read a text, and also reading comprehension score. So after you read a text, how well do you comprehend the score or comprehend that text? Most studies have looked and tested readability formulas solely based on how well they can predict a readability criteria. So we want to know how these formulas perform, and specifically when they're covariated with things like individual difference variables, so reading skills, reading confidence, number of books read, the study design, the order in which the texts were read within the study, and demographic information like age and gender. So this was our methods. We had 60 participants. They all took a demographic survey. 43 of them were females. 23 were, 23 was the mean average. These are your traditional college students, first year, second year students. They also took reading proficiency. So we looked at questionnaires on their reading habits, and we used a very standardized reading comprehension test from that's used often in the United States called the Gates-McGinty. We used 12 texts, and 6 of them were from a normal Wikipedia, and 6 were from simplified Wikipedia. So we had hopefully a variety of difficulty. We had 2 texts from history, technology, and science domains. And each of those texts had 3 multiple choice comprehension questions that were asked. So we looked at a variety of readability formulas, we looked at these traditional readability formulas and these new NLP-inspired formulas, including the new Dahl-Chol readability formula, which includes word metrics or word frequency metrics. We brought in our experiments, we brought in our participants, we put them in a soundproof lab, and we use a computer basically to collect the data. We did use eye tracking, but we're not using it in the studies. But we did track the reading time per text. We got their demographic information. They took the Gates-McGinty test. They had a practice trial, and then they basically read those 12 texts randomized and answered questions. We lost 7 participants, either because of bad data. In one case, we walked in because we monitor them, and the student was just using the cell phone, not paying attention. Low accuracy sometimes in the eye tracking data. So we only had 53 participants in the end. We did a couple statistical analyses. First, we wanted to control for multi-collinearity between readability formulas. This is basically the idea that many of these readability formulas that measure text difficulty in similar ways are measuring the exact same construct. So Fleisch reading ease, FOG, and Fleisch Kincaid grade level were all highly multicollinear. So we just maintained or retained the Fleisch Kincaid grade level because it's the most common. We used linear mixed effects models to predict reading and comprehension scores. Our outcome variables were 2, so we had 2 linear mixed effect models: reading time or comprehension scores. And reading time is basically how long it took them to read a text. Comprehension scores was the average scores for the reading comprehension multiple choice questions. We put in a number of fixed effects, including the order of the texts, because oftentimes you're going to read faster as you go through the experiment. The Gates-McGinty scores, their age, English L1 status, whether they were first language speakers of English or not, participant survey responses for reading and television behavior, and 1 single readability formula. And the random effects were the participants. All right, let's look at these real quickly. I'll point out what's important. Table 1 is for comprehension scores and readability times for our readability formulas. And table 2 is the reading times and scores for individual differences. So column 1 is basically for comprehension. And we see at the very bottom, Dahl-Chol is probably the strongest, followed by Carrick. And then we look at the correlations. This is at table 2. This is reading times and individual differences. Individual differences were not strong predictors of comprehension, except for the Gates-McGinty, as you might expect. And now we'll look at reading speed. And as we might have expected, number 3, CARES, which was developed specifically to measure reading speed, is our strongest predictor of reading time. And for individual differences, we have a number of individual differences measures here. So education, amount reading, confidence in reading, enjoyment of reading, and Gates McGinty. So basically, if students like to read, they read more often, they're more confident in reading, and they have better or higher reading comprehension standardized scores, they're going to read faster. So we threw these into LME models to basically predict comprehension scores. And we can see here in the upper right are three models. The first model is with Carrick, the second model is with Fleisch, Kincaid, grade level, the third model is with Dahl-Chall. Those variables were included, as was Gates McGinty. And this is basically the R-square, how much variance was explained. The best model was with the Dahl-Chall and the Gates McGinty. It explained about 10% of the variance. This was for predicting reading time. In some cases here, we had three variables. So CARES, trial order, and Gates McGinty, or Dahl-Chall, trial order, and Gates McGinty. In this case, the CARES model was the strongest predictor of reading times, along with trial order and Gates McGinty. It explained about 19% of the variance in reading times. So where does this leave us? Hopefully, it gives us some evidence that readability models that employ linguistic features that are more theoretically related to what text processing is supposed to be in comprehension from a cognitive perspective outperform readability models that do not employ similar features. So these newer formulas perform better in the wild than traditional readability formulas like Fleisch Kincaid. So we have these smarter readability formulas, and hopefully we can include them as technological mediators to increase reading success and help students develop in the reading process, and help create foundations for personalized learning environments for learners, in which the environments themselves can automatically select texts that are the appropriate level. So next steps, our sample size was quite small, 12. We definitely need to sample larger texts and include a greater sample of these texts. This will also include for domain and simplification. We had some autocorrelation problems with the study. We might want to consider different measures of text comprehension. We use multiple choice. You can also use closed tests or recall, summarization, or inferential assessment. And we would love to assess familiarity with text domain with our readers. We did not do that. It is quite possible that some readers are more familiar with science versus history text. We were not able to measure that. So that's all I have. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take some questions.
We were talking currently about assessment, but have you considered also these models for training purposes? For training to improve.
Yeah. So the goal, of course, is that we would try to integrate these models into educational technologies, so that the educational technologies could automatically self-select texts that match the reader's potential and the reader's ability, so that they can continuously learn from those texts, and they can continuously have texts that are within their reading range to help them develop. So that is, that's one of our ultimate goals.
And one more question from me. When you were talking about your sample, you had adult sample. Have you conducted any experiments in general education, in basic school, for example, or could you get the totally different results then, or is it how these algorithms are related to the age of participants? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a good question. We generally don't work in schools. It's really hard to get into schools in the United States. The teachers are totally overburdened, overworked, and too many university and academicians want to get into the classroom, so it's difficult. Most of these formulas were developed with adult readers, so I think they probably perform very differently with child subjects. But we have newer readabilities that we've developed based on how teachers think that text will be read by students, and so we're helpful to test those with appropriate populations.
Thank you, Scott, for your presentation. It's more like a comment, but it's a challenge. I think that while I was hearing you, I think that would be very interesting to see these readability formulas working with people who have difficulty in their language. And if you, because these readability formulas are very too broad, too general, but I didn't see now work with people who have language and different language problems. It can be what you have you consider, what do you think about that?
Yeah, exactly. So some of the early readability formulas that we developed were actually designed specifically for English as a second language learners. And what we found is that they need a lot more support linguistically. And what we find is that these formulas benefit more from like cohesion, a lot of like word overlap from sentence to sentence to sentence to keep kind of the semantics of the text on track. And so those type of like we would call local cohesion, connecting ideas together throughout the text really do help second language learners process and read a text better. A lot of our work is generalized right now, as you mentioned. I think that's hopefully because we're starting a new trend. We're doing some state-of-the-art work. The data is becoming more available, and our hope is that more specialized data sets will become available over time. And once we have those data sets, it's relatively easy to start developing more specific models for each individual learning domain and task. Because as you mentioned, we have differences in child and adult, you have differences in learning disabilities, you have all kinds of differences when it comes to reading, and we need to develop formulas that are specific to task and domain. But we just don't have the data yet, but we would love to do that once the data becomes available.